Welcome to the debate. Good morning and welcome to our deep dive. In the realm of classical physics, every action produces a measurable, predictable reaction.
Right. You place a weight on a scale and the needle moves to a precise number. It's, well, mathematically certain.
Exactly. But when we turn our analytical lens to the geopolitical landscape of East Asia today, that precision entirely vanishes. We are no longer looking at a carefully calibrated scale.
No, we're observing a strategic environment covered in a very thick maritime fog. Every single naval deployment, every runway paved on a coral reef is simultaneously interpreted as pure defense and pure offense.
It really depends entirely on where you sit. The very definition of a nation's sovereign border is, while subject to fundamentally incompatible interpretations, which makes miscalculation dangerously easy.
It absolutely does. Before we examine the facts on the ground, we should make a brief note regarding the technology powering today's broadcast.
Yes, this deep dive is brought to you by our sponsor, ProAI, and generated by Stylo News, an AI-powered news application. Listeners should note that Stylo News is the consumer version of the Stylo Intel Ops software.
Right, which is a highly sophisticated intelligence tool originally designed for enterprise operations across government, military, and business sectors.
Precisely. Through Stylo News, you now have unique access to the exact same intelligence-grade analytical tools utilized by global decision-makers to track these very events.
It is a vital capability, frankly, for navigating complex global events, allowing you to synthesize vast amounts of raw data into actionable context.
So today is Friday, May 8th, 2026. Our focus is a strategic debate on China's rise and the contest for power across East Asia. We're examining a central substantive question,
Which is, as China projects military power and utilizes gray zone operations, does Beijing have a legitimate, sovereign right to secure its strategic maritime boundaries and control resources in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait?
right? And conversely, does the United States and its coalition of regional allies have the justifiable right to militarize the first island chain, specifically to enforce freedom of navigation and preserve the sovereignty of smaller nations?
It is arguably the defining security dilemma of our era.
Unquestionably. I will be arguing that the United States and allied actions are a necessary, legally justified defense of national sovereignty and the rules-based international order against unprovoked Chinese coercion.
And I'll be arguing that China's actions are, well, a rational defensive countermeasure. It's a rising power securing its vital maritime trade routes against a provocative U.S.-led military containment strategy.
Let us start by establishing the foundational facts from the current intelligence estimates. China is actively engaged in a systematic campaign to alter the geopolitical status quo.
You're pointing to international law here?
I am. They are ignoring established law, most notably the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling. For those tracking the legal architecture, that ruling unequivocally invalidated Beijing's expansive historical claims over the South China Sea.
Right, the 9-line claims.
Exactly. And we aren't speaking in hypotheticals here. The evidence is physical and concrete. Just recently, China deployed a 352-meter floating barrier at Scarborough Shoal.
A massive structure.
Yes, it isn't just a string of buoys, right? It is a physical, mechanical blockade designed to entirely choke out local Filipino fishermen and assert administrative control without actually firing a shot.
And the developments at Antelope Reef as well.
Precisely. A decade-long pause in construction there has suddenly ended with the rapid militarization of the feature. We are talking about a newly paved 2,700-meter runway capable of hosting advanced military fighter aircraft.
A significant force projection capability.
And furthermore, they maintain a sustained daily presence of over 240 state-funded maritime militia vessels to intimidate regional neighbors. So in the face of this, the Allied response is entirely proportional.
You mean the military exercises?
Yes, we see the massive 19,000-troop Balikatan exercises and Japan's historic first deployment of US-2 amphibious aircraft. These are not provocations. They are a defensive necessity to maintain open sea lanes.
Well, if we are to objectively analyze the strategic map, we must pull back and view the architecture of the Pacific from Beijing's perspective. China is a nation heavily dependent on maritime trade, seeking to secure its strategic depths.
Strategic depth being the distance between front lines and vital industrial centers.
Exactly. Right now, China's economic lifelines are highly vulnerable. Consider the Malacca Strait, a narrow choke point through which the vast majority of China's energy imports flow.
It's a critical vulnerability.
During the period of profound global instability, a blockade of that strait would paralyze the Chinese economy in weeks. So when Chinese leadership looks outward toward the Pacific, they do not see a benign rules-based order. They see a deliberate architecture of containment.
I would argue containment is a strong word when the U.S. presence is largely invited by regional partners.
But look at the actual hardware being deployed. The United States has just deployed MSESS, anti-ship missiles in the Philippine province of Batanes.
Those are the highly mobile unmanned systems.
Right, that fire advanced anti-ship cruise missiles. Putting them in Batanes places them a mere 160 kilometers from Taiwan. Furthermore, India is actively exporting BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles to the Philippines and Indonesia.
A significant upgrade for those nations.
But from the perspective of Chinese decision makers, this looks exactly like hostile military encirclement by an extra-regional superpower building a literal wall of missiles off their coast.
I see the perspective.
When your adversary does that, developing assets like the Type 076 Sichuan amphibious drone carrier is not an act of unprovoked aggression. It is a logical, necessary requirement to push that perimeter back and ensure national survival.
I understand framing it as perimeter defense, but we need to look at what actually constitutes a defensive posture versus coercion. Let us examine the Taiwan Strait. What the intelligence reporting shows is a persistent, normalized pattern of PLA gray zone tactics.
Meaning military actions that stay just below the threshold of triggering an actual shooting war.
Exactly. We are seeing regular median line crossings by military aircraft, multi-domain naval presence, and transits by the Liaoning aircraft carrier group. This isn't passive defense. The underlying mechanism here is psychological and operational attrition.
Attrition in what sense specifically?
Think of it like setting off your neighbor's car alarm every single night at 2 in the morning. Eventually, out of pure exhaustion, they stop looking out the window to check if a robbery is happening.
That's an interesting analogy.
That is exactly what Beijing is doing to Taiwan's military. By making high-level military incursions a daily routine, they are deliberately eroding Taiwan's warning thresholds. They degrade the Taiwanese military's mechanical and psychological response capacity.
Creating a boy who cried wolf scenario.
Right, so if an actual kinetic attack is launched, it looks like just another Tuesday patrol until it is too late. That is an offensive strategy of exhaustion.
Well, the strategy of exhaustion is a widely recognized military concept, but applying it as a blanket explanation for Taiwan's vulnerability ignores the internal political realities on the island itself.
How so?
The narrative often portrayed as one of a completely unified island desperately fending off constant external coercion, but the intelligence paints a much more complex picture. Taiwan's legislative yuan, their parliament, is currently gridlocked over the special defense budget.
Which is certainly a domestic hurdle.
It's more than a herder. They cannot even agree on the funding necessary to secure asymmetrical capabilities like HIMARS systems.
Which are critical, to be fair. HIMARS are highly mobile artillery rocket systems that allow a smaller defending force to punch far above its weight class. They reduce the need for massive, expensive fleets of fighter jets.
Precisely. They are the absolute cornerstone of a porcupine strategy to make the island indigestible to an invader. Yet the Taiwanese legislature will not fund them.
It's a deep division.
Furthermore, recent polling demonstrates that 22.4% of Taiwanese citizens, largely Kuomintang or KMT supporters, actually accept the concept of peaceful unification under a one-country, two-systems framework.
That's a significant portion of the electorate.
It is. So, if the island's own political body is deeply divided on military spending, and nearly a quarter of the electorate favors integration, isn't the U.S. projecting its own geopolitical anxieties onto Taiwan, rather than letting regional diplomacy and domestic politics run their course?
Well, blaming the political gridlock purely on domestic disagreement misinterprets the root cause of that division. The deadlock in the legislative yuan does not exist in a vacuum.
You're referring to external influence?
Yes. It is being actively engineered by China's Taiwan Affairs Office through highly sophisticated information operations and political warfare. The intelligence explicitly notes that Beijing is pairing its physical military pressure with digital influence operations designed specifically to weaken Taiwanese cohesion.
But political debate is the hallmark of any functioning democracy.
Of course. But this is the exploitation of a democratic process to substitute kinetic escalation with political penetration. They are artificially amplifying division so that Taiwan cannot properly arm itself.
I'm not sure it's entirely artificial.
The fact that the democratic system is functioning, complete with budget debates, doesn't negate the external threat. It merely highlights the multifaceted nature of Beijing's coercion. They are attacking the legislative process just as aggressively as they are probing the airspace.
I hear your point, but characterizing the KMT's preference for dialogue as merely the product of Chinese information operations dismisses the legitimate agency of millions of Taiwanese voters.
I'm not dismissing their agency, just noting the informational environment they are in.
But we are talking about a massive voting bloc that genuinely fears that deepening U.S. military entanglement will turn their home into a proxy battleground. They fear it will lead to the absolute economic ruin of their island.
Those are understandable fears.
Right. They are looking at the realities of geography and making a calculated political choice, not just acting as dupes for an algorithm.
Well, let us look at how that strategy of exhaustion extends beyond Taiwan, because the tactical approach we see in the Strait does not operate independently. It requires securing southern supply lines, which brings us down to the broader South China Sea.
A significantly more volatile theater in some respects.
Absolutely. The connective tissue in China's strategy throughout the first island chain is the maritime militia.
A highly debated force and one that operates very differently than a traditional navy.
One, certainly. Just yesterday, on May 7th, 5 Philippine personnel landed on Sandy Cay. Furthermore, Philippine President Marcos Jr. recently mandated the official use of Philippine names for 131 maritime features in the West Philippine Sea.
A bold administrative move.
It is a direct legal and administrative maneuver to assert control over sovereign territory.
We have to analyze the context and the timing of those Philippine actions, though. State-aligned publications out of Beijing, such as the Global Times and China Military Online, view these administrative renamings and the physical landings at Sandy Cay as calculated, offensive provocations.
Provocations? Asserting names on their own territory?
Well, look at why Manila is doing this right now. If you examine the intelligence reporting, it points to a severe domestic fuel crisis in the Philippines. This crisis has been vastly exacerbated by the ongoing conflict in the Middle East.
Specifically, the U.S.-Israel-Iran tensions disrupting global oil supplies.
Exactly. The interconnected nature of global energy markets is crucial here. If you're wondering why a fuel crisis in the Middle East matters to an island in the South China Sea, it comes down to domestic political survival.
The Philippines has literally had to declare a national energy emergency.
Right. So from an analytical perspective, Manila's sudden aggressive posturing on Sandy Cay appears to be a political maneuver aimed at drumming up nationalism. It is an attempt to distract the frustrated domestic populace from severe economic hardship at home, rather than a genuine response to a new security imperative.
The economic pressure on the Philippines is undeniably real, I agree. But it is precisely that vulnerability that China is attempting to weaponize through resource denial. The facts on the water tell a story of deliberate environmental and economic coercion designed to starve the Philippines out of its own waters.
You're bringing up the research vessels?
Yes, we have verified reporting from the Central News Agency and ABC News detailing unauthorized Chinese marine scientific research inside Philippine territorial waters. And even more alarmingly, there are reports of the use of cyanide poisoning near Second Thomas Shoal.
That's a very heavy accusation.
It is described as deliberate environmental sabotage by Chinese fishing vessels to destroy the coral reefs and the fishing economy that the Philippines heavily relies on.
I have to interject. The allegations of cyanide use remain highly contested and must be evaluated cautiously against the backdrop of an intense information war.
Okay, setting the cyanide allegation aside for a moment, look at the mechanics of the maritime militia itself. Consider it a ghost fleet.
A ghost fleet?
Yeah, if a state uses civilian crewed, heavily subsidized commercial vessels to enforce blockades and destroy marine resources, it's a brilliant but deeply cynical tactic. It is like sending thousands of ununiformed protesters to physically block a highway instead of sending the actual military.
Because it shifts the blame?
Exactly. If the local police clear the protesters by force, the police look like the violent aggressors, even though the highway is being illegally held hostage. Doesn't that inherently violate the fundamental norms of peaceful maritime transit? Forcing a smaller nation like the Philippines into a desperate corner where they cannot respond without looking like the instigator?
The characterization of the maritime militia as a rogue ghost fleet ignores the historical context of Chinese maritime administration. China views these waters as its historical sovereign territory dating back centuries.
Which the international courts rejected.
True, but in their strategic doctrine, the utilization of a maritime militia is a localized, low-escalation method of enforcing administrative control. It is a mechanism to establish a physical presence without deploying the gray hulls of the PLA Navy.
By gray hulls, you mean formal naval warships?
Correct. Sending a heavily armed destroyer to intercept a fishing boat is a massive escalation that dramatically increases the risk of kinetic war. By using the blue hulls of the militia, China creates a buffer.
A buffer?
Yes, when the Philippines conducts landings on features administered by Beijing, the militia serves to manage the friction at a civilian level.
I'm sorry, but a buffer that actively rams sovereign Coast Guard vessels, fires military-grade water cannons, and physically cuts off supply lines to outposts is a military force in all but name. Wearing a civilian uniform does not change the kinetic nature of the action.
It changes the escalatory ladder, though.
Perhaps, but this localized coercion has triggered a profound, theater-wide strategic reaction. The friction in the South China Sea and Taiwan is directly driving the expanding Allied coalition. It is critical to understand that this is no longer merely a bilateral dispute between Washington and Beijing.
You believe it's much broader now.
I do. The regional consensus is shifting organically against China's behavior.
The word organically is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Well, look at the participants. Japan, a nation that has maintained decades of strict, constitutionally mandated pacifism, has seen Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi officially authorize maritime self-defense force naval transits directly through the Taiwan Strait to signal international rite of passage.
A major shift for Tokyo, absolutely.
And we are also seeing New Zealand, a country historically quite cautious and geographically distant in its Pacific posture, suddenly announcing a $7 billion military modernization plan specifically geared toward regional security.
Also true.
So when nations thousands of miles apart simultaneously recognize a threat and drastically upgrade their defense postures, it indicates a universally recognized danger to the rules-based order, not just American pressure.
To call this an organic regional shift is to ignore the highly visible guiding hand of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which is the primary architect and financier of this entire military architecture.
They are facilitating it, certainly.
The United States is not just facilitating defensive capabilities. It is actively preparing a theater for a major war. The intelligence shows the U.S. revitalizing World War II-era air bases in Tinian and Peleliu,
Spreading out their operational footprint.
Right, these aren't just historical markers. They are strategic launching pads being cleared from the jungle to disperse American air power. Simultaneously, Washington is funding advanced AI-enabled strike networks across the region.
Strike networks which are strictly necessary to deter the sheer volume of PLA missile forces.
But think about how a strike network actually operates. It connects sensors like a drone over the Pacific to missile launchers hundreds of miles away in the Philippines or Japan. It means any asset in the region can target Chinese vessels instantly.
Which provides deterrence.
It creates a textbook security dilemma. If you build a massive, heavily armed, highly networked fortress right on your neighbor's property line, even if you explicitly say it's just for self-defense, your neighbor is going to perceive it as an existential threat and start buying weapons of their own.
That's the classic dilemma.
Exactly. By actively preparing for a war to deter China, isn't the U.S.-led coalition actually creating the very militarized flashpoint it claims to be preventing?
The logic of the security dilemma is sound in theory, But let us look at the mechanics of deterrence in practice. Deterrence is not a provocation. It is a prerequisite for stability when dealing with an actor attempting to change borders by force.
Assuming the actor intends to use force.
The intelligence timeline makes this abundantly clear. We expect sustained PLA naval patrols and live-fire exercises through the remainder of 2026 regardless of what the U.S. does.
The timeline is dense, yes.
And in late May, the Philippines' state visit to Japan is scheduled to further integrate their strategic partnership and share coastal defense technologies. The Allied coalition is expanding its strike networks because the intelligence clearly indicates that diplomatic protests alone have utterly failed to halt the paving of the Spratly Islands.
So it's a reaction to the paving.
Exactly. If China ceases its deployment of amphibious drone carriers and withdraws its militia blockades from Philippine waters, the security dilemma diffuses itself overnight. The catalyst for the militarization is Beijing's attempt to change the status quo by force, not the regional preparation to defend it.
But the definition of what constitutes the status quo is exactly what is under dispute here. When Japan deploys Type 88 surface-to-ship missiles to participate in the Balikatan exercises, and the U.S. integrates its long-range precision strike weapons into the first island chain, Beijing perceives an overt attempt to permanently sever its access to the deep waters of the Pacific.
Sever access or just regulate it according to international norms.
To China, the status quo the U.S. wishes to preserve is one of permanent Chinese vulnerability and containment. We must recognize that from Beijing's viewpoint, a strong sovereign defense inherently requires pushing the perimeter of potential conflict away from its immediate coastline and major cities.
The critical distinction, however, lies in international law. The United States and its partners operate their ships within international waters and place their assets on the sovereign territories of allied nations at their explicit democratic invitation,
which Beijing views as proxy containment.
But China's territorial expansion relies on claiming international waters as domestic lakes, in direct contravention of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
A convention, I must accurately point out, that the United States itself has never formally ratified.
A fair technical point, though the U.S. military strictly operates in accordance with its customary legal principles, treating those waters as a global commons.
Right.
Well, let us summarize our positions in light of the mechanisms and data we have reviewed today. The intelligence estimates paint a picture of a region under immense, multi-domain strain.
That is undeniably true.
My perspective remains that the military coalition building we see from Japan's shift in posture down to the Philippines' defense of its reefs and all the way to New Zealand is a necessary, measured response. It is a vital architecture designed to enforce international law and protect the sovereignty of smaller nations against the systematic campaign of coercive, gray zone tactics by Beijing.
And my assessment of the intelligence leads to a different structural conclusion. I maintain that China's rapid naval modernization, its deployment of advanced assets like drone carriers, and its territorial defense measures are proportional responses.
Responses to containment.
Exactly. They are the calculated actions of a rising global power attempting to secure its vital economic lifelines against a highly aggressive, U.S.-led military containment strategy that explicitly seeks to encircle it within the first island chain.
What we can definitively agree upon is the sheer fragility of the current geopolitical landscape. The convergence of advanced military assets in the first island chain, the amphibious drone carriers, the supersonic cruise missiles, the AI strike networks, and thousands of forward-deployed troops leaves virtually zero margin for error.
None at all. A single miscalculation by a militia vessel or a Coast Guard cutter could ignite a global conflict.
Absolutely. And this fragility is heavily influenced by cascading global distractions.
Right, as we noted, the Middle East energy crisis and the resulting supply shocks are exerting immense domestic pressure on nations like the Philippines. It forces rapid, sometimes unpredictable geopolitical calculations just to keep their economies afloat.
The interconnectedness of global trade, domestic fuel prices, and regional security in the Pacific has never been more apparent.
It really hasn't.
The intelligence indicates there is still much to explore regarding how these multi-domain operations will unfold throughout the rest of 2026. For our listeners who wish to monitor these fast-moving developments and truly understand the mechanisms driving global strategy, the insights discussed today were powered by Stylo News.
It is an exceptional resource for those who require depth and context rather than just sensational headlines. The Stylo News app is available for both mobile and computer platforms.
Right, it allows individuals to securely download and customize personal, intelligence-style briefs drawn dynamically from hundreds of traditional news sources and X.
It gives you the full spectrum of sentiment analysis.
We highly encourage you to utilize the exact same grade of analytical tools we rely upon for this broadcast. Subscribe to Stylo News to get AI-powered news on demand by visiting www.stylonews.com.
Thank you for joining us for this Friday debate. We genuinely appreciate the time you spend with us examining the underlying mechanics of these complex global issues.
We certainly do. We invite you to submit your requests for future deep dive topics, and please remember to follow Stylo News on your favorite social media platforms. Until next time, remember that when looking at the strategic environment of East Asia, the most critical factors are often hidden in the fog. Have a wonderful day.